And they're going to look at a little bit at Xamarin. If you're doing some mobile app development, we're going to spend a little bit of time with Kevin Bost, who's recently been nominated as an MVP for Microsoft. And he's going to talk about Xamarin Forms and give an introduction into some new WPF functionality that's coming out with .NET Framework 3.0, .NET Core 3.0. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. By the way, there's a competition. Whichever speaker has the most slides is going to get an award. Just so you guys know.
Just for reference, my slide deck consisted of one slide until I got here this morning, and then people kept adding to it. So we're now at slide 3. I had one. Then they kept wanting more. So yeah, like Mark said, my name is Kevin. We are going to take a little bit of time looking at what I'll call thick client applications, so specifically Xamarin Forms, and then a little bit of looking at WPF and what's new and available with .NET Core 3. When I was kind of going through this week trying to prep and figure out, okay, what's important, what should we cover, what is going to actually be interesting to show you guys what's new, I kind of started going through it, and I quickly realized, okay, let's make sure I get all my machines up to date. Let's get everything running. And so yesterday I went through, I updated my Mac OS, I updated the Visual Studio for Mac. I then reinstalled Visual Studio for Mac because I botched it the first time and it started crashing. Last night at about midnight, I updated Visual Studio on this box. So we're going to see. All of the demos worked a few hours ago. So I'm hoping that everything continues to work exactly as planned and we can go through that. And with that, that is the end of my slide deck, as it should be. So starting off, just kind of a brief overview. I think most people have probably heard of Xamarin already. It's basically Microsoft's arm for if you want to do mobile development. It's how everybody pictures it of iOS and Android apps. It's actually more than that. You can build Mac OS apps with it if you want. If you want to code your fridge, they've got Tizen support now. Great. You've got support for watch and wearables and all of that kind of stuff. So when you hear people mention Xamarin, just understand that all of that kind of flows under that umbrella. Going a little bit further than that, you'll hear people then start referencing Xamarin Forms. So then let's get out of this and get into something more interesting. So when you hear people reference Xamarin Forms, this then takes this whole idea of rather than going for a whole bunch of C# code that just runs on all other platforms, to figure out and say, okay, now I actually want to start sharing that code. Because anyone can write kind of a class library, a DLL, share code around like you've done before. That's fairly simple and straightforward. But Xamarin Forms takes that one more level and says, okay, now I want to actually share a lot more of my UI code and logic. Not necessarily a common UI, but UI code. I want that behavior to flow through. I want, when I go through and declare my login screen with a username, a password, and a login button, I don't want to rewrite that twice. I don't want to do that again on iOS and Android. It's basically the same thing. Yeah, I want it to look like an Android app. Yeah, I want it to look like an iOS app. Yes, I want it to run with native performance. But ultimately, I don't want to write that code twice. That's a lot of work. So that's what Xamarin Forms actually aims to do. These top 3 rows are what's really important of kind of just sort of understanding. I didn't test this part of the demo. I just assumed that displaying an image would work. We're going to keep going. So in both of those stacks, you've got your native controls. iOS and Android, they've got their own equivalents of buttons. They've got their own entry fields and inputs. And I'm just going to pretend that that's still there. And with the Xamarin Forms, you end up building out your UI logic, usually with XAML. So for people who have done UWP or WPF, this should feel very natural and familiar to you. XML-based language. If some people have done like HTML by hand, heaven forbid, it sort of follows that sort of same type of layout of what you go through and build. But then you have the question of how do I get from that XML-based layout ultimately down to that native level code? Because that's what I want. I want to write my XML stuff once. I want it to be native when it actually gets to my device and is running. And right in the middle are these renderers. And this is sort of the key thing that Xamarin Forms actually brings, is these built-in renderers that say, okay, we're going to give you this XAML framework. We're going to give you these built-in renderers that are going to basically be that go-between for you, to go between that native code and your shared UI logic. This is what actually lets it build and work. And I'm just going to trust that you're going to keep going. Okay? So that's sort of a basic overview of how Xamarin Forms works, and keep those renderers in mind because we're going to be coming back to them a little bit later in this. Back about 5 months ago in May, Microsoft used to have something called Xamarin University, where if you wanted to go and start diving in and learning about how Xamarin Forms works and all of that, it was a great resource that you could do. Back in May, it finally met its end, and so you used to have people that were Xamarin mobile developers, and now that certification has gone to the wayside as well. But what they did instead is they took all of that content that they had in Xamarin University and actually brought it into something called Microsoft Learn. Has anybody actually looked at Microsoft Learn yet? It's somewhat new-ish. So I just kind of want to point this out because even for some of the other stuff, the Azure stuff that we're talking about, this is a wonderful resource to be able to go and dive through. There's basically sort of two things. You've got learning paths and then individual modules. I'm just going to pretend like that's going to keep up with me. And so down in all of these, we can go and filter ourselves down to just the Xamarin stuff. But you can go through, you can think of the modules as like individual classes. If there's one particular thing of you're interested in saying, okay, you know, my app needs to be able to go through, set up data, store it in a SQLite database. How do I go through and do that? They've got these individual ones. If you want to go through basically what the Xamarin University and Xamarin certification used to be, a lot of it is covered in this Xamarin Forms learning path, which is basically just a whole bunch of modules walking through the individual pieces of what do I need to get started, what does it take to actually go through and do it. So if you're just getting started with Xamarin and you're looking for where do I get more information, how can I go and learn this stuff, this is an amazing resource to go through and do it with. All of the content that used to be Xamarin University has been brought forward and brought into this. Microsoft Learn, Xamarin stuff. Most of this talk, I don't intend to actually dive very deep into exactly how most of the Xamarin stuff works. And really, I just wanted to leave you guys with an idea of what was there, what features were out there, and what the capabilities were. And usually when people start looking into some of the Xamarin stuff, one of the biggest problems is, okay, what's in the box? What do I get when I actually start running, and what do I actually have to build out myself? And there is a library that I don't think gets quite as much recognition called Xamarin Essentials. For reference, don't worry about these URLs. We've got a repository with all of our stuff, these links and everything in it. So at the end, if you guys are interested in that, we've got it. But Xamarin Essentials basically goes through and tries to smooth over this idea of most of the time there's a whole bunch of information that your app may want to go through and access. I want to get device information. I want my app to be able to kick off, sending an email for the user. Things that you see happen in all of the apps on your guys' phones. And with Xamarin Essentials, they've gone through the pain of trying to smooth over this idea of, of what's the different Android API, what's the different iOS API, and how do I make that easy to work with? So for most of the stuff, if you're looking to figure out, okay, what can Xamarin do, assume that a default setup should be, okay, file new project with Xamarin Forms, and then you almost assuredly want to pull this guy in. If nothing else, there's probably something in here that your app is going to need. Very few apps are going to end up getting built without needing some level of this functionality. And yes, you could go through and build this stuff yourself. You can go through on Xamarin Forms. There's nothing stopping you from saying, just because I have got shared code here that works well, there's nothing saying that, okay, on the Android side, I want to do something Android specific. You can do that on Xamarin Forms. There's different levels of, how much control do you want to take and how much responsibility do you want to take on. But this smooths it over so that you can then end up writing as much of your code in the shared library and sharing that as possible. Most of the time on a Xamarin Forms app, it's not uncommon to have 95, 98% of your code base shared between your apps. Okay? It's usually a very high number. Okay, so let's take a look. So, new project, Xamarin Forms. And for reference, for all of this stuff, latest Visual Studio 2019, 16.3.0, I believe is the latest release. Default project Xamarin Forms. Next, we're not actually going to finish this, so we're just going to keep going, because app 1 sounds great. And then you're going to end up coming into an option, and I believe I can do this. where it comes through with a bunch of different templates. Now, what's new in Xamarin Forms 4, so in the last, I think, 6 or 8 months, Xamarin Form 4.0, 4.1, and now 4.2, I believe, is the preview release right now. The two big features that have come out of those are something called shell, or Xamarin Forms shell, because that term doesn't get overused enough. And then Xamarin Forms visual, which is going to be the ones that we're going to look at. So most of these templates were here before, but what is new is this guy right here, and this mobile backend. Okay? So if you're just getting started and it's saying, okay, I want a Xamarin Forms app, you know, my app probably needs to talk to some sort of backend system, probably. You probably are going to want to build it with ASP.NET Core, especially if it's greenfield development type stuff that you have, or if you're just wanting to see how would I set up that kind of interaction to have it flow through, file new project, you'll get a working solution right out the door. Now, instead of actually waiting for this to launch, I've cheated and already created one because I did not trust myself enough. So the default app that it goes through and builds out for you is your standard to-do app. Okay, so you can add tasks. They have a title, they have a description. I think we've all probably seen that demo about 50 times. I'm not going to go through and bore people with it. But what's actually interesting here is taking a look at what does Xamarin Forms shell actually end up looking like. So somebody confirm, I think that's big enough and readable. Yes, thumbs up. I'm getting head nods. Cool, we're going to keep going. So when you go through and start a new Xamarin Forms project with shell, you're going to end up with this app.shell.xaml file. And this is the big new feature. Now, the goal with shell is the Xamarin team noticed that when people start building their apps, one of the biggest hurdles that they start running into is how do I deal with navigation between my pages? Because you end up with some sort of design, whether you do it yourself or you get something from a designer that says, okay, I've got my login screen, and then maybe the user goes to this screen and they want to view user details here, and the user wants to pull this information here. We got to view our to-do list. We need to have a screen to go through and add a new item. How do I do that interaction? And in Xamarin Forms prior to 4, you didn't really have anything out of the box. It was, here you go, build up your pages, you deal with the navigation. Yeah, sure, we're going to give you a push-pop type method to be able to do that navigation, but there was nothing sort of overarching to actually do that structure. You were sort of left up to yourself to figure out what is this going to do and how is this going to work. So with Xamarin Forms shell, they went through and said, okay, there's two kind of main layouts that we see people doing. Something where you've got sort of your hamburger menu up in the side with the flyout, and you kind of pick your option there, or something that usually involves some sort of tab type bar, whether it be sort of bottom tabs there, maybe a top tab bar to go with submenu type items. And so that's what's been built into shell. You can go through and lay out your app, and the default one comes into here. So, and just to prove that this works, I do have iOS and Android running here. So let's grab this guy, because I believe I've got my list app on both. And for reference, these guys are both pointed to that same Azure App Service. I just did right-click Publish, sent it up to Azure, and away we go. Okay? The only thing that I had to change was changing the URL out to point to my subscription's URL once it went up. That's not the right page. Go back. Cancel. And clearly, Android needs to be fixed. We'll come back to it. But it's this sort of basic app, and when you go through and set up the tab type layout, like what you see here, you end up on both iOS and Android with, that's not the right one, that one, with sort of this bottom tab approach. Okay? The page itself doesn't contain any of the navigation features. If we go and actually take a look at what ends up in the items page, it's a stack layout, it's a list view with a bunch of items, and that's it. All of this extra chrome around the outside of, okay, this add button that we've got going on up here, these tabs at the bottom, this is all being controlled by shell. So sort of as the name implies, it's expected to sort of wrap around your views and give you that outside stuff. Stuff that comes built in the box with shell is basically your navigation bar at the top. It adds search functionality, so if you have sort of a list view where you want to do searching and filtering and that sort of thing, that comes out of the box to where you can build it, and you can turn all of this stuff on and off as you see fit. Okay? Going back over here. So, and I think this is probably, unfortunately, where I left my Android app sitting, is you can then get really fancy and figure out, okay, what am I going to do? Do I want individual flyout items? That's not where we're going. Promise I can type. Always harder with so many eyes. But on the individual flyout items, so now from the side, I'm saying, okay, when the user goes through and picks this flyout item, I want a tab bar along the top for sort of sub-navigation to go between a couple of my shell content pages. I want my main shell content to just show my items page. And then I want these two tabs along the bottom as well. So all of this sort of header, footer type information and how that navigation goes between them, you lay out in one spot so that you can see the relationships between all of your pages and have all of that flow through. Okay? Any questions on shell? I do not mind, like Mark said, if people throw out questions in the middle. I'm happy to go through and show them. Make sure I'm not too far off my bit. So most of the stuff that has come through here, and I'm going to actually switch over onto Android because clearly I am in a broken state. Let's put this back to where it's supposed to be. Take a look at it. Come on. Commenting code is not hard. So deploy to my Pixel. So a lot of the kind of the smaller improvements, if you go through the Xamarin Forms release notes, are all about trying to improve the development cycle. This whole idea of I have to make code changes, I have to compile, I have to deploy to my emulator or device, I have to test them, I have to realize, oh crap, I made a mistake, let's go back and fix it, do it again. That takes a lot of time. And especially on mobile, you'll watch what an Android build can do, especially one that's probably going from a clean state. It can take a while. Now this isn't necessarily a great high-end machine as a good example of performance. I'd say average, maybe a little lower. But it can take a while to actually do that full deployment out. Okay? And some of it is not necessarily in Microsoft's control. They're using the native tool chain under the hood, just like you would if you were building this with Android Studio or Xcode. So some of the performance problems aren't necessarily something that's inside of their control. But what Xamarin said is, okay, well, you know, we may not necessarily have control of the whole tool chain that we can go through and fix the build speed, but we can cut down on this development loop. What if we didn't have to actually go through and stop debugging? What if we could just make edits and see them launch right inside of our emulator or simulator? What if I can make edits right inside my app as it's running on the phone and see those changes come up? So that's what they went through and did. So let's take a look at this. So this is a preview feature. So from inside of your Visual Studio, Tools, Options, underneath the Xamarin, there's this Xamarin Hot Reload. And the key word here is preview. So it works pretty well. It also falls over a lot. So just be aware of that. But we can come in here and let's, come on Android, go out. I know, querying a web service is hard. I promise it'll work. Did my Azure query really time out? It's a memory store. Let's just jump over here. So the items page. And you go ahead and think about what you've done. So inside of our XAML, this whole idea of having to wait, and while that thing's thinking, we're going to go ahead and just switch over here. And we're going to launch up, let's do the Android side of things if we can, because hopefully this guy connects. So what you aren't seeing is I don't have a Mac sitting here. I've got a Mac hiding over in the corner over there, but it's not plugged into any monitors. I'm running this thing headless. You saw the Mac simulator here. This runs on Windows. I don't have to actually physically connect to a Mac. You need a Mac to be able to compile an iOS app. There's no way around that. Apple ensures it. But there's no reason that you have to have a Mac that you're actually doing your development on. If you like your Visual Studio environment, you've got your tools and your tool chain set up there, great, keep using it. This is the way I end up building my iOS apps. I like Visual Studio on Windows. And this is just going to keep shooting me, isn't it? Awesome. Come on, don't do this to me. Like I said, it's just great when you go through and do all your demos right at the end. Setting up the renderer, it's thinking about what it's supposed to do. So inside of the XAML, one of the other small features that they went through and added is this idea of design time data. And there we go, finally. So on the right here, I'm getting a preview of what is my items page going to look like. So from the actual app, you'll notice this doesn't include the shell stuff. And why am I getting notifications from Teams? Teams needs to be off immediately. It's just the inside portion of my shell, just the content of my page. And you'll notice inside of this design preview, it's getting close-ish. Like if we look at it, we'll notice, okay, well, it's kind of got the relative font sizes pretty close. It's missing on the colors. This design preview is one of the things that they added to try and make it quick and easy for you to develop. But you'll notice it's also showing different content. So inside of Xamarin Forms, and this is different than all of the other XAML frameworks, is you can go through and put design time data on any property you want. It doesn't have to be tied to just item source or data context or pre-populated stuff. I can go through and say, my item source, I'm just going to populate this with a bunch of strings, which is what we see here. I can come in on my label and I can say, you know what? When I'm in design mode, we're not going to deal with the actual object behind the scenes. I just want that string directly. For design mode, I want my text color to be red because reasons. And I get a nice preview. Now, this is important to note, this is a preview. This is not reflective of what your app will actually look like at runtime. It's a best guess, okay? Because you'll note that this text color, even before my preview one, didn't quite work. Because when you have resources and things that it has to go and look up, it's only looking at this one page. It can't necessarily go and resolve this context of what this page is ultimately going to look like at runtime. Okay? Now, if we can get this thing to play nice, let's just jump over to the About page and see if we can get this guy to actually demo the way I want. So let's come down here, and I'm just going to pick on this label. So that comment before about the hot reload, let's do text color because that's an easy one to see happen. I make a change, I see it running. For people who have worked in things like UWP and WPF, this is like, finally, this is what we've had for a while now. But this is now in Xamarin Forms. And this also works on your actual devices, not just on your simulators and emulators. There's a docs page where you do need to go through and make sure that you actually have all of the prerequisites. There's minimum Android and iOS versions. There's minimum Visual Studio versions. If you're running the latest stuff, targeting recently new hardware, you're fine. Okay? But it does let you go through and start making changes. And obviously, there are changes I can make in my XAML here that aren't going to be able to be propagated forward. Things like if you register up a click handler, that's not going to automatically start working for you across. You're going to actually have to stop, recompile, and push out. But if you're looking to go through and do it, I tend to not like the XAML previewer at all and much prefer this. I don't want a best guess of what my app might look like at runtime. I want to see what it is looking like at runtime. Yeah?
Does that also take into account changes to data binding?
Does it also take into account changes to data binding? The answer is kind of. It depends on what the changes are. So if it's, oh, I didn't actually get my property name correct, let me fix that in the XAML, sure. If it's, oh no, I need to change this, the moment you start touching anything that has to do with the C# or the generated code behind, it's probably not going to work. Okay? This is mostly just XAML layout stuff. And certain amounts of additions and deletions are also going to cause it to just give up. Correct, yeah. Binding handlers, those types of things, it's going to start to fall over. It's also important to note that your incremental changes that are being hot reloaded, you should probably always relaunch your app one more time because those incremental steps that got you to a particular result may not be the same as the code that you've now written that's all the way there. Okay? Because it is possible to do incremental changes that leave you in a different state than what the code is actually saying. Okay? But then the Xamarin team said, okay, well, this is great, but we just have all those limitations that we just said, right? It's like, wouldn't it be better if I could go through and edit all of my code? Like, this is great for editing my XAML, but I just said that I can't edit things like click handlers. I can't go through and edit my C# and have that just automatically reload on my emulator without recompiling. So this is not released yet, but there is, and once again, they're going to reuse the term a little bit more. Not to be confused with hot reload, hot restart. Okay? This is in private preview right now. So if you are interested in trying it out, I was hoping to get into the beta before this to show it, but was not able to. This is supposed to actually let you go through, make edits inside of your code, and have your app restart. Okay? This is very similar to the edit and continue that some of you may have used inside of your C# and other types of apps, where it's, hey, I want to make these changes, and I want it to automatically just deploy out those deltas and see it running right here, right now. Okay? This then ultimately brings this same type of functionality into Xamarin. For anyone who's had to do sort of that long development process with mobile apps, this is very, very exciting to me, because this is expected to save me tons of time. Just being able to go through and do the hot reload, get my R words correctly, has already been very helpful in being able to just template out UI changes. Okay? So being able to actually see all of that flow through. Okay? So one more feature that came. So besides shell, the other big thing that the Xamarin team heard from feedback from people is, you know, it's really great that you guys have gone through and given me an ability to write my app once, share all this UI code, have it look native on both platforms. But you know what? I really don't want my app to look native on both platforms. I've got a particular brand. My app needs to look this way. I want it to look as close to my branding on both of these platforms as I can get. And right now, the tools that you've given me that say, let me make it look the way I want, it's really cumbersome and makes me do a lot of coding. So I said, OK, that's great. We hear you. Let's go through and try and make this better. So going back to that very first screenshot up here, this renderer layer in the middle. Okay? What the Xamarin team did is they said, OK, we're going to add this new feature called Xamarin Forms Visual. Okay? We want to give you guys better control over the actual visual representation. Because, you know, a button's still a button. I want to tap on it. I want it to click. Just because you say, OK, for my particular branding, you know, I don't like these rounded corner buttons. Darn it, I want this thing square. Stop messing with this stuff. Let me make it look the way that I want. So they said, OK, we can do that. And what they did is they implemented Xamarin Forms Visual, and they gave you one pre-built visual out of the box, Google's Material Design. So for Android users, you're already used to this look and feel. It's that very flat sort of color look. You don't see a lot of gradients going across it. Everything's done sort of with elevation, not a lot of shadows. It feels sort of flat is the wrong word because it definitely has depth to it. But it's the default look and feel that everyone's used to seeing when you talk about an Android app. Okay? So the Xamarin team said, OK, we'll go through. We're going to show you guys how to go through and create visuals, and we're going to give you material design. We're just going to build that into the box. So what you end up doing if you want to bring in material design to take control of it, one, you stop debugging so you get the right menu option. And you go through and you bring in one NuGet package. Xamarin Forms Visual Material. You add a NuGet package, and then in each of your apps, for those people who've done a lot of Xamarin development with third parties, this will feel very familiar, is you have to go through and initialize the library. Okay? And you're almost done. The last thing that you then can do is on each of your elements, you can go through and set a visual. Okay? And right now with the material design stuff, you have two choices, default or material. And the important thing to note is this visual property inherits down your tree. So if you say, I want everything material design, you know what, that's the look that I'm going for, I want all of this to match, great. Go right at the top, visual, material, done. Whole page is converted. All of my controls will now render with the material design look and feel, and I'm going to get a consistent look between my iOS and Android. Now, this is a more consistent look, but there will still be differences between the two platforms. iOS and Android don't expose the same sort of APIs or necessarily the same look. There are still some differences. You know, iPhones, you still have to take into account the little notch on your navigation bar. Stuff has to be different, but that doesn't mean that it has to be drastically different in the look that it has. Okay? So on these, I believe if I get really lucky, I can actually go through and show sort of what these are supposed to look like. So I wanted to show. So the first button here is the one that's just the default Xamarin Forms. I've done very little styling. This is the File New Project out of the box look and feel. The bottom one down below is the Material Design button. I mean, very obvious on iOS, at least right out the gate. It's got a different color. These are just the default theme colors that come with it. Change the theme colors to match your branding, please. On Android, you'll notice the first button, again, this is the native Android button out of the box. Again, default theme colors. But the second one, now we're starting to get that consistent look. If we dive really close, we can start, let's see, quit hijacking my screen. Give me that, and let me switch over. I'm going to make you trust me, because apparently this guy doesn't want to let me zoom while it's grabbing my keyboard shortcuts. There is a slight difference in the shadow underneath the two of them between the Android and the iOS. But without zooming in, it's really, really hard to see. Okay? And this is all that it takes to go through and do it. Now, with the visual feature, there's nothing stopping you from going through and creating your own visuals. Okay? So the way this ends up working under the hood is they've gone through and created up these renderers that implement the material design spec for all of the basic default controls. Okay? If you want to go through and create your own visual that's not material design, great. You can do so. You can derive from their renderers. You can derive from the default renderers and do what you want, but you can still take advantage of, now I've got an easy way of applying these renderers, whereas before the only way you really had to control which renderers were used was based on the control type, which didn't allow for a lot of hierarchy or hierarchical changes. It's, okay, well, if I want my button's renderer, now I have to use not the Xamarin Forms button, I have to use, my derived button class in order to make sure that I get my renderer. Or I have to throw away their button renderer and put mine in its place and do a whole bunch of work going back and forth. With visual, you've now got an easy way of saying, okay, I'm going to go through and select out which renderer I want on a per element basis, or I'm just going to inherit. But it gives you a nice, easy way, if you want a consistent look and feel, to go through and get that. And if you like the Google Material Design, all of the hard work is done for you. Set your theme colors, and you're good to go. Okay? Questions? Okay. One last thing I want to touch on, only because I love XAML, and this is XAML related, is we are going to take a quick look at WPF. It's worth knowing WPF with .NET Core 3 now has .NET Core support. Great. Okay? This does not make WPF cross-platform. Nothing in the least. This is still a Windows desktop application. It runs on Windows, only on Windows. The benefits of .NET Core is you now get all of the performance improvements that have come over .NET Framework. Simple example is system.link. Your skip take methods on Framework do a lot of iterations. On Core, those things are now optimized for like list implementations. Great. Pick that up for free by switching over. Should you switch your app to .NET Core? Not unless you have a significant forward investment in the app coming. Okay? It is a decent amount of work to go through and port an app, especially an older one, from .NET Framework to .NET Core. Definitely look at it. It's worthwhile evaluating. But understand that it is a significant investment without a lot of gains. Okay? But going forward, everything is going to be .NET Core. So if you're building a brand new app, definitely target Core over Framework. Okay? If you've just got an app in maintenance mode, it's probably not worth porting this thing over to Framework. The last thing that you pick up, and this isn't necessarily WPF specific, because Windows Forms gets this as well. You can now run Windows Forms with .NET Core if you want. But you now have single file deployments. So previously, if you were going to go out and deploy a WPF app, you either end up writing an installer, do some sort of zip file with a whole bunch of stuff in it. You use a third-party, PostSharp, Fadi Construa, something to be able to bundle everything into a single exe to be able to push something out. All of that's now built in for you inside of .NET Core. Okay? There are 3 things that you have to do to go through and turn it on. You have to set a particular runtime, because once you say, I want to bundle this stuff, you have to actually tell it what you're targeting. Okay? The whole idea of any CPU and JITting it, not with the single file executable. This Boolean for publish single file just turns the feature on. And then the last one is this publish trimmed. This used to be something that existed inside of the mono library that would actually walk through your IL, figure out what APIs you weren't using, and strip that stuff out. So if your app uses a lot of reflection, this can bite you, and you need to go through and look at the configuration for telling it which features you turn on and off. Xamarin developers are already familiar with this. Our linker goes through and does this and strips out a lot of our SDK APIs that we aren't using, and occasionally it strips out stuff that we actually said, no, we really are using this, trust me, I'm just getting it via reflection, you just can't see that I'm using this API. Okay? But if you're going to publish a single file executable, you probably want to turn on publish trimmed, because especially for like simple apps, like maybe a simple WPF or a console app, this can easily cut your size down by 100 meg, I think is what this app drops down to. This is just a simple hello world. But this is all that it takes to go through and do it. The last thing that you do need to know, you do have, if you're going to do the publish from inside of Visual Studio, you do have to rebuild the application first. Okay? When you go through and do the publish, we'll fire this guy up. You'll notice the configuration here, despite the fact that it's hiding, is pointed at release. So if you were to do like the .NET publish command from the command line, normally it will do a build for you unless you pass the no build flag. Inside of Visual Studio, it's not going to automatically do this build for you. It's just going to try to publish out. And you will end up getting errors if you don't have a build done already. Okay? So make sure that you have a build, even if there's not code changes, if it's just the CS prod changes, you do need to rebuild, because the files that the single file publish uses get done as part of that build process. Okay? But then you end up with a single executable. Fine. That tab doesn't work, but we can dive in, release, NetCore app, target framework, underneath the publish, and I've got a single standard executable with a PDB for the symbols if I want it. Okay, questions? Comments, heckling? Kelly? So can you target multiple runtime identifiers? Yes, rather than just the single runtime identifier, there's also a runtime identifiers. I believe it's semicolon separated. Don't quote me on that. I think. Yeah, the common ones. There are specific ones if you want to target Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10. But the more generic ones are WinX64, WinX86, WinArm, and WinArm64. Other questions? Come on, I know Mark talked me up, but I wasn't that good. Some laughter. There, you are alive, and not everyone's asleep. That's excellent. Okay. Thank you, guys.